Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're going to dedicate today's shir for Shlema for all the people who need a refuah shlema. In particular, we're going to have in mind Leah Bas Masha. It's actually a member of the shir. And please God, we should have just good health for everybody and refuah shlema for those who need it. And we should have only good things. Today's Mishnah is attributed to a rabbi called Rabbi Eliezer Hamudai, okay, or Rabbi Elazar Hamudai. Okay, so who is that? Who is this person? So first of all, anybody who's familiar with a little bit of geography, you'll know that it's clearly talking about somebody who lived in Modi'in. So today, Modi'in is considered, obviously like a very upscale, great part of Israel for people to live. Back in those days, Modi'in had a reputation, and it wasn't necessarily a positive reputation. Modi'in played a big role in the Hanukkah story. That's where the family of the Chashmonaim originate. But at this point in history, which a little bit later, Modi'in had the reputation of being distant from Jerusalem. And that's not geographical distance, because I'm sure you know that the geographical distance is actually not so big from Modi'in to Jerusalem. Although I suppose in those days when you didn't have cars, maybe it was a little bit longer. But the implication was that Modi'in was a place that was spiritually distant from Jerusalem. In other words, not really keyed into the same spiritual ideals as Jerusalem had. Obviously, Rabbi Elazar is an exception. He's an individual who stands out in that community. And he stands out specifically for his expertise in an area of Torah that is called Agada, not to confuse with the Haggadah, which is only on Pesach. Agada is the part of the Torah, or specifically the part of Talmudic literature, that is all about the stories, the insights into the meanings of verses, the personal messages and lessons that you could learn from things. So he was known as an expert in Agada, as opposed to most of the sages of his time who were experts in Halacha, in the legal side of Judaism. Now, Rabbi Elazar had a nephew who was quite an interesting character at this particular point in history. You've definitely heard of him. His name was Bar Kokhba. You heard of him? Bar Kokhba, who unfortunately later was renamed by the sages Ben Koziva, because he kind of let everybody down. But Bar Kokhba initially emerged as this great rebel who led a very successful campaign against the Roman occupation. It lasted for a number of years. And many of the sages believed, like Rabbi Akiva, that he was Mashiach. And Rabbi Elazar Hamudai was one of his great supporters. In addition to the fact that he was his uncle, he was actually a supporter of his. But the sad part of the story is, by this time, Rabbi Elazar was already an older man, and there was all kinds of distrust in Bar Kokhba's camp. And at some point, they accused Rabbi Elazar of actually conspiring against Bar Kokhba, and he landed up being killed by that community, by that group of Bar Kokhba's loyalists. So it's quite a sad ending to his story, even though he was at that time already an older man. But in fact, he was considered to have lived till quite a long time, quite a long life. But nevertheless, it was a very, as you can imagine, dramatic ending. Now, what we're going to see in the Mishnah today, this Mishnah attributed to Rabbi Elazar Hamudai, is he's going to speak about 5 things. 5 things that he says cause a person, in spite of all the other good deeds that they may have, these things would cause a person to lose their portion in the world to come. So what we're going to do is we'll learn the Mishnah, then we'll just go through an analysis of what these 5 things actually are, what they mean, and then we have to understand the key question over here: why would these 5 things be so damaging? Why would these be things that could disrupt a person's position in the world to come? In fact, a number of the commentaries ask a very interesting question, that in the Gemara Sanhedrin, so Sanhedrin is the Gemara that talks about the roles of the high court and the punishments that they could execute people with. And all the way towards the end of Sanhedrin, there's a chapter called Chelek, Perek Chelek as it's called. And the reason it has that name is because it begins by saying, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem Chelek lo'olam haba, that all of Israel has a portion in the world to come. And it quotes it from a verse, the pasuk that proves to us that we all have a portion of the world to come. And then it says, ve'elu, and the following are the exceptions. So first is the general sense that everybody has access to the world to come. And then there are a few exceptions, which of course raises a question in its own right, and perhaps if we have enough time, we'll address that question. But the commentaries here ask the question, why is Rabbi Elazar's Mishnah, which speaks about losing your portion in the world to come, over here and not in Sanhedrin, where the conversation takes place? It does seem a little bit odd. And seeing as we know that Pirkei Avos speaks about what's called mili de chasidusa, the undertakings and obligations that a person has to go beyond the letter of the law, perhaps that's the clue. Perhaps over there, the Mishnah in Perek Chelek talks about things which are unequivocal, black and white, definitely drive a person from this world, or well, from the next world. And over here, he's talking about expectations that perhaps are a little bit higher, as we shall see. But let's read the Mishnah and see what the 5 categories are. And then once we've done that, we can start to analyze. So Rabbi Elazar HaMoidoi Oimer, Rabbi Elazar HaMoidoi says, category number 1, HaMechalel Es HaKochim. A person who causes kochim, kochim means things that have been designated for holiness. Usually the word kochim refers to sacrifices. So HaMechalel Es HaKochim. That means that if a person causes something which was initially sanctified to become ordinary, to become mundane. Now, what would that mean? If we take this at face value, we know that kochim refers to the sacrifices that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash, and there were certain rules that surrounded those sacrifices. One of those rules is called pigul. Pigul means that there are certain critical times during the process of a sacrifice where the intention of the kohen makes all the difference. So specifically at the time when he slaughters the animal, and at the time when he sprinkles the blood onto the mizbeach, onto the altar. At that time, if the kohen has the wrong intentions, he could disqualify the sacrifice. So one of those wrong intentions is what we call pigul. Pigul means that every korban, every sacrifice, has an allocated time within which it has to be consumed. Some of them have to be finished by the same night. Some of them have 2 days and 1 night, depending on the nature of the sacrifice. So if the kohen prepares the sacrifice, now he shechts the animal, or he sprinkles the blood, and at that time, he intends to eat the sacrifice after the time frame is over, nobody knows what he's thinking except him, disqualifies the sacrifice. Another way to disqualify the sacrifice would be not to have that intention, but to do it in practice. So let's say that the Kohanim, who are supposed to eat the sacrifice within a certain time period, and they don't, they keep it over time, or let's say it's the Korban Pesach where you have to finish eating it by midnight, and somebody doesn't, and they keep it over. So that would also be mechalel hesakochim. You take something which is supposed to be holy, and because it hasn't been dealt with properly, it becomes considered profaned. Or if a person, a kohen, would serve while impure, so then he would contaminate the sacrifice, could no longer be used as a sacrifice, would become profaned. Or the last example is not necessarily unique only to sacrifices. If a person would use anything that is designated specifically for the Beis HaMikdash, doesn't have to be an animal, could be anything. Somebody decides that they're going to donate a piece of wood, some material, whatever it is, and they designate something for the Mizbeach or for the Beis HaMikdash, for the temple, and somebody else comes to use it for their own personal benefit, they profane that which is holy. Okay, so that's number 1. Category number 1 that Rabbi Elazar talks about. Category number 2, v'hamevaze es hamoyados. Somebody who disgraces the festivals. Now that's very interesting in its own right. You know, it could have said words like, I don't know, hamevaze es hashabbosos, don't you think? Because that's more common. Shabbos happens on a weekly basis. So if you're talking about somebody who disgraces the times that Hashem has allocated, you would have thought the first time that we're going to be conscious of is Shabbos. And yet we say over here, Mo'ed. Mo'ed refers to Yom Tov, and according to a number of the commentaries, it talks here specifically about Chol HaMo'ed, the intermediate days of Pesach and of Sukkot, where people think, listen, it's not Yom Tov, so it's not a big deal if I go to work, it's not a big deal if I do X and Y. So that's actually, according to many of the commentaries, what he's referring to over here. Hamevazeh es hamoyados doesn't mean somebody who disgraces Shabbos or Yom Tov, but specifically somebody who disgraces Chol HaMoyed, because people tend to take that more lightly. And they tend to think, it's not really a Yom Tov, what's the big deal? That's category 2. Ve'hamalbin penei chaveroi borhabim. The third category is a person who, now, if you translate this directly, it's very interesting. Somebody who causes his friend to pale in public. Malbin comes from the word lavan, which is white. So somebody who causes a person to go pale in public. What would cause a person to go pale in public? So the Gemara explains that it refers to somebody who embarrasses somebody else in public. And it's very interesting. Again, a number of the commentaries point out the same thing. When somebody is initially embarrassed, they go red. But if they're mortified, they go white. And so that's based on that, the Gemara tells us that a person who causes somebody to pale out of embarrassment in public, it's as if you, God forbid, killed that person, because you can see the color drains, the blood drains from their face. So that's akin to killing the person. And a number of the commentaries point out that, the nature of people is we kind of ebb and flow, much in the same way as we exhale and inhale, as the heart pumps blood out and then allows blood to flow back in. So that's the nature of people. So when a person is first embarrassed, the rush is to the outside, like as if they want to respond. I guess it's the fight and flight impulse. So that's the red. They want to respond. And then when they realize that they actually are so devastated that they cannot respond, that's when they go pale. So here he says when a person gets to that point where you've made them go pale, that's when a person, God forbid, loses a portion in the world to come. The fourth category is a person who desecrates the covenant of Avraham Avinu. Now we all know what that is, of course. We know that that refers to circumcision. That's what a bris is. And you have to wonder, why does he say specifically the bris of Avraham? Why doesn't he just say the bris milah? We all know what that is. So why is he dafka attributing it to the bris of Avraham? By the way, you could ask the similar question on the previous one. Why does it say somebody embarrasses his friend? Why doesn't it just say a person who embarrasses another person? Okay, so there are a number of interesting things over here. How does a person desecrate the bris of Avraham Avinu? Well, there are two ways that the commentaries suggest. The most practical way is a person who refuses to have a bris. Once upon a time, Jews laid their lives down in order to have a bris. You listen to stories about people in communist Russia. You listen to stories about people in the concentration camps. You listen to stories of the time of the Roman occupation where it was illegal to have a bris, or the Spanish Inquisition where people went underground and they hid their Judaism. And people literally put their lives on the line in order to have a bris. And today, in our great, progressive, open-minded society, you have people, unfortunately, in the Jewish community who they make a conscious decision not to, God forbid, mutilate their child. And they don't want to have a bris. So the halacha is that if a person is not circumcised as a baby, then as they become an adult, it becomes their personal responsibility. So that would be Mefer Brisoi. Mefer Brisoi would be the person who refuses to have a bris as an adult if they hadn't had the opportunity as a child. The alternative explanation is, again, all of the commentaries concur on this, that Mefer Brisoi Shel Avraham Avinu would be a person who has a surgical procedure to reverse the bris. So either way, it's clearly a rejection. The whole purpose of the bris is to have a covenant between Hashem and us, a permanent covenant that is part and parcel of our actual persona. And here's somebody who wants to undo that covenant. And category 5 is v'hamegale fonim b'Torah sheloi ka'alocha. Somebody who exposes insights into the Torah that do not match with the way that you're actually supposed to apply Judaism in practice. In other words, they've got all kinds of nice theories. They believe that they've learned a lot. They believe that they're a big scholar. And they have their insights that they share. It just so happens that these insights are not what we call alibo de hilchasa. They don't fit with what Judaism really believes. And unfortunately, this does happen, when sometimes you find people with these broad insights and wonderful explanations, and it all sounds so absolutely beautiful until you realize that it contradicts fundamental principles of Torah. So in any one of these 5 cases, even if the person had Torah under their belt and had many good deeds, mitzvahs, to their credit, such a person does not have a portion in the world to come. Really interesting, right? So he's making a very powerful statement. You might have a person, one of these people might be a great Torah scholar, and they may have done many mitzvahs, and yet these 5 things could completely undermine their opportunity for a portion in the world to come. And we need to understand why. We need to understand why that is. Now, what's interesting over here is you could actually split these into categories. For example, when you talk about desecrating kochim, kochim are animals. Yes, of course, they're animals that have been sanctified to become sacrifices. But the reality is they are animals. So that actually deals, if you think about it, with one of the lowest levels of life, the animal kingdom. As opposed to on the opposite extreme is Torah. The last example is somebody who misreads or misinterprets Torah. So it shows that there's a spectrum over here. And so effectively what we define is we say that there are 3 realities. There is a very physical reality represented by animals. There is a medium reality represented by the constellations. And we determine when Yom Tov is, Moyados, based on the constellations. There's a supernal reality, which is Torah. So what Rabbi Elazar effectively is talking about over here is that a person might get it wrong in any one of the 3 external realities, external to the person. So a person might get it wrong in the so-called materialistic world. They might get it wrong in the so-called, the world of, I don't want to say outer space as much as the constellations and the powers that Hashem has implanted in our world. They might get it wrong in terms of the highest degree, which is Torah. That's the external world. And then he identifies 2 elements where a person could get it wrong in their internal world, in the personal experience. One is embarrassing other people. Embarrassing other people means that you don't see the value of the next person. So that would be a person who discredits the value of the physical self. And the second one is the person who doesn't want to have a bris. So that's somebody who desecrates the value of the spiritual self. Okay, so that's possibly one of the ways we could divide all these categories. So let's unpack this this Mishnah bit by bit and try and understand, what it is that a person is doing over here that is so wrong that could cause a person to lose their connection or lose their access to the world to come. So what we're going to look at over here is we're going to see something really interesting about the theme. There's a theme that has to run right through this Mishnah. And once we identify what that theme is, the rest is detail, and the detail falls into place. Now, the theme of a Mishnah very frequently is introduced in the first line. So let's go back to the first line. What did he say? Ha-mechalel es ha-kochim. A person who causes holy things to become profaned. That's the introduction to this entire Mishnah. So what's he telling us? Yes, on the face of it, he's talking about a very specific scenario, an animal or an item that had been made holy by designation, and now a person comes along and desecrates it, either by having the wrong intentions in the case of the sacrifice, or by using it for personal use in the case of something else that was designated. But there's a broader picture over here. The broader picture is, how is a Jewish person meant to look at the world? We're talking about how you get into Olam Haba, how you get into the next world. How does a person get into the next world? How do you think you get into the next world? What do you think? You sign a petition online, and then they say, yes, thank you very much. We appreciate your sentiment, and we're going to allow you into the next world. It's not how it works, right? How does a person get into the next world? You have to earn your opportunity to get into the next world. How do you earn that opportunity? By living in this world aligned with what Hashem wants. So when it comes to doing what Hashem wants, it's very easy for people to say, what does Hashem want? Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, that is true. That is correct. And yet it could be completely misleading. Look at what he says at the end of the Mishnah. he says we're talking specifically about somebody who has Torah and has mitzvahs, right? That's what he says at the end of the Mishnah. Even if you're dealing with a person who has Torah and good deeds under their belt, still they could lose their opportunity to enter the world to come. How's that possible? I have Torah and mitzvahs. How can you possibly preclude a person from the world to come if they have Torah and mitzvahs? So that's the point that Rabbi Elazar wants us to know. You have to understand that Judaism teaches us that there's a worldview that we are supposed to not just adopt in the theoretical sense, but apply in real life. What is that attitude? That attitude is that the world is meant to be where we take the mundane and we turn it into something that is holy. That's our goal. Our goal is to make kodshim, to make things holy. So the process of a sacrifice is just an example. Take an animal. Animal is part of the world. It's part of the, not just the world, but the lower part of the world. And what do we do with an animal? We turn it into a sacrifice. We reconstitute it as something that has spiritual value, that has holy value. If a person's unable to do that, then what they land up doing is they land up denying Hashem's purpose for this world. They land up separating the world from its potential. And if somebody does that, they effectively go against everything that Hashem had in mind for the purpose of creation, and for that reason, they lose their portion in the world to come. So let's see how this works. Basically, what we're going to notice is that there's a degree of heresy that underlies all five of these categories. What's heresy? Denial of Hashem. And a more subtle and very important expression of heresy that we have to examine as Jewish people is not just denial of Hashem, but denial of Hashem's purpose. So, let's go through them. The first example that we had was we had a person who says that they don't see the value of a korban. In other words, what are they saying? What they're saying is, this is an animal. How can an animal possibly be of value to God? God is infinite. What, does God have an appetite? Does God need to be fed? Does God need the reyach nichoyach that the Torah speaks of, this pleasing aroma? No, what are you talking about? So the first thing this individual does is tries to separate God from the world. Hashem doesn't need all this stuff. So therefore the person who says, maybe they don't actually physically do something to undermine the sacrifice, but in their mind, they profane the sacrifice, because in their mind, they say it cannot have value. Many people fall into this trap. They believe that Hashem is so powerful and so great and so infinite, why would the physical world be of any interest to him? And of course, the next step of that thinking is, so does Hashem really care? That's what we keep telling ourselves, right? Does Hashem really care if I keep kosher? Does Hashem really care what time I start or end Shabbos? Does Hashem really care if my mezuzah is at this angle or at that angle, or if the letters are spelled correctly, if it's a little bit faded? Does he really? He's beyond all of that. That's a person who says that it is impossible to find holiness in the physical reality. So he says that that which the Torah declares as holy, this person sees as profane. This person sees as completely mundane. And therefore, they deny Hashem's purpose in this world. Now, that kind of thinking is going to carry straight over into moyados. What are moyados? So in the most direct and simple translation, moyados means festivals. Now, we all know how Jews are on festivals. We all know, right? If you think about it, here we are. Let's use Rosh Hashanah as an example. Rosh Hashanah is a very profound time. It influences the entire year to come. It's a time of connection to Hashem, accepting Hashem's authority. It's a very serious spiritual time. And what do? Yes, we daven. Yes, I know. We go to shul and we participate and we daven and we listen to the shofar. But we also have a big fancy Yom Tov meal. In fact, the Gemara even asks the question, Any normal thinking person who was going through a very serious court case, would they have the appetite to sit and have the kind of elaborate meal that we have on Yom Tov? And that's Rosh Hashanah. What happens when you come to the holiday of Sukkot, for example? What a pleasure. You're supposed to be happy. The Gemara says, Ein simcha ela bebasar, that you only celebrate simcha by having meat. Ein simcha ela beyayin, you only celebrate simcha with wine. So this person, who Rabbi Elazar is saying has no portion in the world to come, is clearly a very sensitive spiritual soul, who says, that cannot be a moyed. That cannot be a time of dedication and holiness and spirituality. Look at all the gluttony that happens. Look at all the overeating. Look how people get drunk. Look, you call that a holiday? As far as this individual is concerned, if we really wanted to have special times on the calendar for connection to God, then they should have been meditation retreats, where you'd have a chveis, I don't know, fresh bananas and water or something like that, to cleanse your system. I don't know exactly how they would see it. Means that he undermines, this individual undermines the possibility that a moyed, a time of celebration, could be a time of holiness. Now, as far as Judaism is concerned, that's dafka the point. The point of being Jewish is to get involved in the things of this world and elevate them to holiness. So in our minds, if you can't eat and you can't celebrate, how's that a Yom Tov? How have you affected the world? How have you elevated the world? So a person who misses that will come across to any of us as being such a holy, incredible human being. So sensitive. Truth is, so misguided. And then the next that he says is, what's the next category? Hamal bin Penei Chaveroi. Right? Hamal bin Penei Chaveroi. Person who embarrasses somebody else, or as we've described it, somebody causes another person to go pale from being so incredibly embarrassed. It's very interesting. If you have a look in our history, you'll see that there are people in our history who went to such great lengths to ensure that people wouldn't be embarrassed. Take, for example, Yosef. Yosef with his brothers. I mean, they really didn't treat him well, right? We know sibling rivalry is a big deal, but this was like another level. Because we have brothers who were ready to kill him. And then eventually, at the last minute, instead of killing him, they sold him. Okay? I could think of quite a few families, I'm sure, where the siblings wouldn't mind doing that, selling one of the siblings, Settle things. Now it's years and years and years later. And the brothers come down to Egypt, not because of any choice of their own. They have no choice. There's a famine. Egypt's a place we have food. And they come face to face with Yosef. They have no idea that they're face to face with Yosef. At the time that Yosef eventually, after doing all the things that he does with them, he makes them feel a sense of remorse. And eventually comes to the point that he's going to reveal his identity. The Torah says clearly to us that he told everybody to leave the room. So that no Egyptian should be there when his brothers would feel embarrassed now discovering who he is. Because it's known in our heritage that you don't embarrass people. In fact, the Gemara goes further than that. The Gemara says it'd be better for a person to die, and not just to die, but to die in fire, which is a particularly painful way to die, rather than to embarrass somebody else in public. Says the Gemara, how do we know this? So we know from a story of Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda was one of the brothers of Yosef, son of Yaakov, and he had a whole story where he lost his wife, and then he lost 2 sons, and his daughter-in-law, who was really now supposed to marry his 3rd son, he delayed it. He felt she was a black widow, it was going to be bad news. So he delayed what's called the Yibum marriage between her and his youngest son. And her name was Tamar, and she had she wasn't waiting around. She had a very interesting spiritual insight, knowing that Yehuda was going to be the forerunner of all the kings of Israel, and she wanted in. She wanted to be part of that. So she comes up with a very elaborate story where she disguises herself on the side of the road as if she's a prostitute, and she effectively seduces Yehuda. And sometime later, he has no idea who she is. Sometime later, he gets news that his ex-daughter-in-law is pregnant. And because of her position in society, she was technically the daughter of a Kohen, so it was a capital offense, and she deserved to be burnt to death. And she's being led out to be killed. And she had some personal effects of Yehuda's that she had taken, and she sends it to him privately to say, perhaps you recognize these things. Now, she had every right to make a big announcement, as anybody would have done today. She would have gone into the mass media, and she would have shared it on Facebook and who knows what, and she would have said, it's him, he's the father of the child. She didn't do any of that. She left the ball in his court. If he was going to acknowledge, great. And if not, she was going to go be burnt alive. From that we learn how much Judaism believes that a person has to ensure not to embarrass somebody else in public. So why would somebody now do this? Why would somebody not care enough to embarrass another person in public? The only reason would be because the person says, what's the big deal to embarrass somebody? So what? It's just a physical experience. It's not the real you. The real you is your soul. Your soul is untouchable. There's nothing I can say or do that is in any way going to harm your soul. Okay, so you'll feel a little bit of embarrassment. Nish gefährlich. Maybe I have to say something that needs to be said. Maybe you need to hear it. And the only way to say it is in this particular way. So again, it's the same theme. You see that this person doesn't recognize that there is holiness in the physical human experience. There's holiness. The body is holy. A person's feelings are holy. A person's experiences are holy. And so, yes, you cannot embarrass a person. Why? Because that individual is holy. So then this real Chacham, who has such a beautiful spiritual perspective on life, says, you're right. You're right. A human being is holy because a human being has higher faculties, like a brain, like emotions. Those are higher faculties, and those can definitely connect with holiness. But a human being also has lower faculties. And some of those faculties are associated just with the base hedonistic drives that are common to both humans and animals. That part of the human being, that part cannot have any connection to God, surely. The lower part, the lower functioning elements of the human anatomy that are just there for pleasure, surely that doesn't have a connection to God. So this person says, I'm willing to accept the possibility of holiness in our world. I'm not willing to accept that possibility in the lower functions of the human anatomy. So he's mefer brisoi. He sees that it is impossible in his mind that Hashem would make a covenant with a human being that involves the physical anatomy and certainly the lower dimensions of the physical anatomy. So we say to that person, now you've really completely missed the point. Because the whole point of Judaism is dafka to take the lowest realm and turn that into something which is holy. That's why the bris was dafka associated with a part of the human body that could be so misused. A part of the human body that could be so easily tempted into sin. Because that's our goal. To take even that part and turn it into something which is not just holy, but the symbol of an eternal covenant between Hashem and his people. And finally, this person who has this great spiritual, open-minded, elevated perspective on life believes that the most important thing in the world is what you learn, what you know, and what you meditate on. And Judaism says, actually not. The most important thing in the world is what you do with the things that you learn and that you meditate on. So that's why the final description he gives over here is what happens when a person is megale panim ba'Torah sheloi kehalocha, a person who learns elements of Torah that do not align with halacha. What's halacha? The practical application of how you do Judaism on a day-to-day basis. How you actually behave. You can have the loftiest ideals, the most complex spiritual attitudes. It's all irrelevant until it translates into action. So, any person who reveals an approach to studying Torah, where that approach is not bound with halacha, that person has completely lost the plot, and they could have all the Torah in the world, they could have all of the Maisim Tovim in the world, and that person, at the end of the day, still doesn't have access to the world to come because they've completely missed what it is that that Hashem wants from His world. Maybe just a slight variation on the theme. So he mentions 5 things. Why 5? Because the Gemara tells us that this world is created with the letter Hey, which has the numerical value of 5. That implies that this world has 5 facets to it. And what are those 5 facets? The first is an understanding that there is holiness in this world. So that's the first level of heresy, where a person turns around and says, there's no holiness in this world. There's no such thing as holiness in this world. The second level is to say, not only is there holiness in this world, but there are moyados. What does moyados mean? There are special times within the year. In other words, that tells you that there is a dynamic connection between Hashem and His world. So the second level of heresy is a person who's willing to say, okay, Hashem created a world, and that world had historically a sense of holiness, but it's not ongoing. It's not current. There's no moed today. That's the second. It's not as bad, but that's the second level of heresy, is to say that there is no consistent flow of holiness into the world on a moed basis, on a regular time basis. The next level is the person who says, no, there is definitely a flow of godliness in the world. I'll acknowledge that. That Hashem has a connection with His world on a regular basis, but I don't believe that people are the conduits of that connection. In other words, this is the person who denies that fundamental principle right at the beginning of the Torah, that we are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. That's why it says to embarrass somebody, what do you care? Hamegale panim. That's why we have to talk about the face. What's the difference if his face turns colors? It's a human face. We say, no, it's not a human face. It's a tselem Elokim. This is a connection to God that is expressed in this face. Then you get people, they're quite common in today's world. They'll say, you know what, I believe that there's a God, and I believe that God has a purpose for this world, and I believe that there's a dynamic connection between God and His world, and I even believe that there's a dynamic connection between God and people, but all people are the same. There's no such thing as a unique Jewish connection. I don't believe that. No such thing as a unique Jewish connection. So the person who doesn't believe in a unique Jewish connection, that's the person who says there's no value in a bris. What's a bris? It's just some kind of a tradition that was passed down during the course of time. You know, it was maybe in the old days, it was for health reasons or whatever the case is. They were more primitive than we are now. They needed this protection, blah, 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 whatever the particular things people come up with. But that there's a fundamental distinction of a Jewish nation, don't agree with that. That's the person who denies the bris. That's the 4th level, so to speak, of heresy. And the last one is the person who says, there is, of course, something as Torah, which we were given as a unique Jewish people. We believe it. There was a revelation at Sinai. It really happened, but it doesn't have anything to do with halacha. One of the interpretations of halacha, and in fact the word is used very frequently this way in the Gemara, halacha means the things that were passed down by tradition from Moshe, the things that are not written in the original scriptures. So this is a person who says, I don't deny God, I don't deny purpose, I don't deny the value of the human, I don't even deny the uniqueness of the Jewish people, but I deny the fact that all the stuff that the rabbis came up with is actually valid. So Rabbi Elazar says any one of those 5, not only outright heresy where a person says that there is a complete break between God and His world, but even when a person gets to the point that they question and second guess those traditions that are passed down through our history, those are people who exclude themselves from a portion in the world to come. Now, one of the fundamental principles of Judaism is not just that the world has the capacity for holiness. And if you deny that, if you deny the fact that the world has the capacity for holiness, then you've denied Hashem's entire purpose. That's not the full story. There's a specific detail within that story that is incredibly relevant to us. What is it? Not only are we supposed to believe that the world has the scope to express holiness, to become holy, we have to believe absolutely that that is our job. Or to put it differently, It is a fundamental belief of ours that the world only becomes holy when we make it holy. If you're waiting for Hashem to do some highfalutin, whatever experience, like blow us out of our minds and pull open the heavens and reveal himself, and that's how the world is going to become holy, well, then you've missed the point completely. The entire purpose of Judaism is that we are the catalysts. We make the world a holy place. And so Rabbi Elazar is teaching us over here that if any person reaches a philosophy that believes that we don't make a difference to the world, that is heresy. And that's what bars a person from access to the world to come. So that's why the first example he uses is Hamechalel es HaKodshim. What are Kodshim? Kodshim is you have an animal. It's part of a herd of animals. God doesn't make this particular animal holy. We do. We as human beings, either as an individual who's donating an animal as an offering in the Beis HaMikdash, or as a community that has to every single day in the morning and in the evening bring a communal sacrifice, however it happens, somebody walks into that herd, into that flock, somebody selects one animal, and that then becomes the animal that is holy. Hamechalel es HaKodshim means if a person doesn't believe that I, as a person, I don't believe in the principle that the world could become a holy place. If I don't believe that I could be the one who makes that difference, that I could take part of this world and turn it into holiness, if I don't believe in that, then I'm not just denying my potential, I'm denying Hashem's purpose for creation. That's why he says that the next category is Hamevazeh es HaMoyados, somebody who desecrates Moed. Now there's a big difference between Moed, which is a Yom Tov, and Shabbos. Shabbos we don't get to choose. We don't get to determine. Shabbos comes every single week as it's sunset on Friday night, ready or not. So if you turn around and you say, I cannot believe it, it's already Shabbos again. Well, that's just how it is. It's not going to wait for you. And if a person says, it's inconvenient for me, I don't really want to have a Shabbos this week, well, that's also unfortunate. We don't get to choose. As the expression goes, Shabbos is mikdash v'kaimo. It is already pre-set as holy. Yom Tov is different. As we say in the Kiddush on Yom Tov, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim, that Hashem sanctifies the Jewish people, who in turn sanctify Yom Tov, because we make the calendar. Nowadays, it's just a calendar that's online. You just check 100 years in advance. But originally, every single month we had to go and check. And when we saw the moon, then we would dedicate Rosh Chodesh. And based on that, that would decide when Yom Tov was going to fall out. So Hamevazeh HaMoyados means that a person doesn't believe that humans can make days holy. Hamechalel es HaKodshim means somebody doesn't believe that people can make things holy. Hamevazeh HaMoyados, the person who desecrates Yom Tov doesn't believe that we can make time holy. That's a form of heresy. That's why in the next example he says, Hamalbin penei chaveroi, somebody who embarrasses his friend. How does somebody become your friend? You have to work on it. He's highlighting not just the fact, although it's true, that you shouldn't desecrate or disparage any person because every person is holy, which is true. But he's highlighting dafka chaveroi. If you have created this holy relationship, because that's what a friendship is, it's a unique relationship between two people that has been created by people. So if you don't value that relationship, you don't value what humans can achieve interpersonally, that is somebody who loses their portion in the world to come. That's why when it comes to the bris, he specifically says, Brisoi shel Avraham Avinu, that we should know, why do we have a bris today? Where did it come from? It came from Avraham Avinu. And how did Avraham Avinu have a bris? He had to do it himself. It was a tremendous sacrifice, as you can well imagine, a person of his advanced age, a tremendous sacrifice to be able to have a bris, and he had to put in the work himself, and every single one of us until today, we still have to have a bris. Why? Because he did. In other words, our bris has to feel the capacity of me to make myself into something different, to make myself into a holy person. And that's why he concludes by saying, what's the final category? The person who learns Torah and arrives at the wrong or inappropriate conclusions. Why? Because it's human endeavor. You have to learn the Torah. Megaleponim. It is your responsibility. You have to learn the Torah. Not only do you have to learn Torah as a parrot, you have to learn Torah with innovation and looking to find things that you could innovate and teach in the Torah yourself. But it has to be kahalocha. It has to be aligned with the valid principles of Torah. You will notice at the end of the Mishnah, he says, even if a person has Torah and Maisim Tovim, even if he has Torah and good deeds in his hands, he loses the portion in the world to come. He does not say, as it usually says in the Gemara, Teshuva or Maisim Tovim. Why? Because no matter how badly a person may have messed up in any one of these 5 categories, if they do Teshuva, they always have the opportunity to reconnect. Anybody have any questions?